out of nothing. They're creating an entire culture out of nothing, out of thin air. So they're free to do whatever they like. And I recommend a visit to Shanghai, to Pudong, just to see the possibilities that exist in China today.
Incredible. And that is, I mean, Shanghai is, if not already, then the biggest shipping city in the world, I think, and it's growing tremendously, as you say. Do you think that is primarily, as I mentioned before, Western money behind this, or are the Chinese now doing this on their own since they've gotten the backing to start up this kind of experiment from the West?
Well, a lot of the money is their own at this point. As we know, in the United States, famously, they hold roughly $1 trillion of foreign currency, most of it American debt. So it depends on your point of view. Is it Western currency? Yeah, possibly, but it's money that we owe to the Chinese because of our demand for their exports. So their export culture has always been very strong. At this point, though, they're not relying upon exports so much. They have developed such an internal market. The way in the United States, their biggest market was internal. Now in China, it's taking over gradually. They're building a middle class. So they are building a large base of their own businesses, which are growing by leaps and bounds. And they're still strong economically as far as exports are concerned. So what used to be foreign economic investment back in the 80s and the 90s is now being gradually replaced by local Chinese direct investment. It's an interesting segue that's taking place.
So let's get into Chinese alchemy a little bit. I mean, I know that the roots are what I thought at least were more Eastern, implying the Arabic root of the word alchemy, of course. But I didn't know that the Chinese kind of had their own version. Is that how it's been developed, or did they the Chinese precede the Arabic and Middle Eastern type of alchemy, Peter?
Well, it's an interesting segue because in speaking of alchemy, we're talking about changing base material into gold, and that seems to be what China is doing these days. They're able to perform an alchemical transformation in their own society, which is, I think, in my mind, which is connecting all of these concepts. Chinese alchemy was largely concerned with human health as opposed to actually changing lead into gold. To the Chinese alchemists, they understood that was a metaphor. But for them, gold was immortality. And to the Chinese, immortality did not mean to live forever, but it did mean to live for hundreds of years. The ability to prolong life indefinitely, to live healthy indefinitely. And they believed, just as the many Western alchemists did, that this involved using very dangerous chemicals like poisons, but in very strictly controlled dosages to increase life. But it was also a mystical and spiritual quest as well. So you had meditations that were devoted to the astronomical constellations, to the groupings of stars. There was a lot of mysticism based on the Big Dipper, what we call the Big Dipper, which they called by various names, one of them being the chariot of the north. This was a vehicle. The Chinese understood that this constellation was a vehicle towards the North Star that would lead you to the North Star. And the North Star was the axis of the universe. Because it did not rise, it did not set, the North Star was a constant. So it was the symbol to them of immortality. As I began to go from the Chinese alchemical texts and start to read texts from India, from Egypt, from Babylonia, from other places, I saw a constant consistency between all of these ideas, that everyone had a mysticism based around this particular constellation and the North Star. And that's what led to the thesis that I propose in Stairway to Heaven, is that this is the constellation par excellence. This is what mystics around the world have focused on and have encoded it in different ways. There are 7 stars, and there are 7 stages to the alchemical process and 7 stages to the mystical process, things like that.
Interesting. And do they overall have a different zodiac than the Western world does as well? Do they have the classical 12 constellation, or is that different as well?
Well, they have their own complete different star charts. So they saw the stars in different clusters than we did. They gave them different names, different ideas. As we know, there's a Chinese zodiac, but it's all various animals. As far as the Western zodiac is concerned, that was adopted, but adopted much later. So they had their own astronomy and their own astrology, which was separate. And this is what's interesting to me. Many cultures had separate approaches to the zodiac, separate approaches to the stars in general. But they all seem to agree on this one particular constellation, and they all gave it the same name. They all called it a chariot or a wagon, something that implied a vehicle. And they all referred to it this way, whether it was in the East or the West. They seem to agree on that. They may disagree on everything else, but they agreed on the identification of this particular constellation as somehow a vehicle towards spiritual transformation.
Is that connected to the ladder as well of the seven stars?
Yes, it's the same thing to me. It's the ladder of lights. It all is consistent. I looked at the book of Ezekiel in the Old Testament. This is what actually got me thinking along these lines. And Ezekiel is very clear. He says on a particular day, month, and year. It's one of the few places in the entire Bible where they're that specific. On this day, month, and year, in this place, in Babylon, he was in the Babylonian captivity. He looked towards the north, specifically, and he had this particular vision. Well, he was looking towards that constellation, and the vision he had was of an angel or a god sitting in a throne in a chariot which had wheels. And he's describing, to my mind, that constellation. Later mystics, Jewish mystics, would refer to this type of mysticism as Merkava mysticism. And Merkava is the chariot. And there was a whole idea based, a whole method, a whole process of Merkava mysticism, which is that there were 7 levels, perhaps 7 chariots, 7 palaces, 7 throne rooms, that led you gradually to complete communication with God. And this idea of the 7 levels, I often wondered why the number 7. Most people will say, well, 7 planets and the 7 days of the week. But that's putting the cart before the horse, no pun intended. The 7 planets, the ancient people were not quite that stupid. They did know the sun and moon were different from the other 5 planets you could see with the naked eye. They did not confuse them all and say they were all equal, they were all the same. They knew better than that, and any research will tell you that in the ancient texts they're very clear about it. So if it's not the 7 planets, then what was it? And gradually I came to the understanding that it was this particular constellation. Once I understood Chinese alchemy, revered it, and they literally have a mystical process in which they walk on the stars. They have a diagram on the ground, which is the diagram of that constellation, of what we call the Big Dipper. And then they will walk from star to star to star in a mystical pattern, gradually reaching the final destination, which is the North Star. I saw exactly the same technique being used by Jewish mystics in the 5th, 6th, 7th centuries of the Common Era. So somehow in Palestine and in China, at the same time, they're performing the same type of mystical journey. And I think they were not in communication. They were not exchanging notes in those days. So I think this was a independently arrived at idea that somehow that constellation referenced spiritual integration, spiritual transformation, and communication with the divine.
Where have you gone to kind of get some information about these? Or are there libraries in China where you can still find some of these texts, or have you maybe directly gone to a few alchemists that still are around in China, or is this suppressed and under the communist regime in any way, Peter?
Well, Mao very famously attacked Taoism and Confucianism, but especially Taoism and Lao Tzu and the teachings of Taoism, because he said this was putting the individual ahead of society. So he was constantly denigrating this process, and for decades after, Taoism was rigorously suppressed. It's only now gradually in China that you can talk about these things more or less openly, and there are scholarly conferences now in China in which these things are discussed. People are seeing benefit in at least examining this without actually practicing any of it. I think you will find more of the texts in the Chinese diaspora